It was the winter of 1953, and a man in a gray wool overcoat was sitting across a metal table from two CIA officers in a safe house outside Frankfurt. He had crossed the border 11 days earlier with nothing but a forged transit document and a name he had memorized: Alan Foster. He was a colonel in Soviet military intelligence, and he had spent 3 years studying American weapon systems for the General Staff in Moscow. Before his debriefing was finished, he would say something that surprised even the officers who had interviewed dozens of defectors before him. He told them the weapon that frightened Soviet planners most was not the atomic bomb. It was something smaller, something quieter, and something that American soldiers carried in their hands. The Cold War intelligence archives, portions of which were declassified beginning in the 1990s and continuing through the 2000s, contain hundreds of defector assessments compiled by the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence and the Defense Intelligence Agency. They describe a Soviet military establishment that watched American combat performance in Korea with meticulous, almost obsessive attention. The analysts in Moscow read after-action reports, studied captured equipment, interviewed prisoners, and spent enormous resources trying to understand what had actually happened in the valleys and ridgelines of the Korean peninsula between 1950 and 1953. What they found disturbed the assumptions that had guided Soviet military planning since the end of the Second World War. To understand what Soviet planners feared, you have to understand what they believed they already knew. The Red Army had defeated Nazi Germany in the largest land war in history, absorbing casualties that would have shattered any Western force and driving 3 million soldiers westward from Stalingrad to Berlin. Soviet commanders had developed a doctrine for modern warfare built on mass, on depth, on the willingness to absorb staggering losses in exchange for positional advantage. They had watched American forces in World War II from a distance and drawn conclusions that shaped everything that followed. The Americans, Soviet analysts concluded, could not fight without their machines. They depended on air power and artillery to an extent that revealed an underlying weakness. Take away the air cover and the ammunition supply, the argument went, and American soldiers would be exposed as undisciplined civilians in uniform who lacked the ideological commitment to sustain combat under genuine pressure. Korea was supposed to confirm this theory. Instead, it systematically destroyed it. The conflict began in June of 1950 when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel with 135,000 troops, Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks, and a training doctrine modeled directly on Red Army methods. American and South Korean forces collapsed in the opening weeks, retreating more than 300 miles in what became one of the most harrowing rearguard actions in modern military history. The Pusan Perimeter, a defensive rectangle in the southeastern corner of the peninsula covering roughly 140 miles of front, held by fewer than 100,000 UN troops against repeated armored assaults, seemed to confirm Soviet assessments about American fragility under pressure. Analysts in Moscow watched the maps and waited for the final collapse. It did not come. What happened instead would generate classified studies, internal debates, and urgent requests for more information that consumed Soviet military intelligence for years. The problem was not simply that American forces stabilized the front, counterattacked, and drove north past the 38th parallel. Problems of that kind could be explained by logistics, by air superiority, by the general industrial advantage that any analyst already factored into their calculations. The problem was how American forces fought at the small unit level, in the hills and ravines where machinery counted for less and individual soldiers counted for more. The problem was the rifle. The M1 Garand had entered American service in 1936, becoming the first semi-automatic rifle issued as standard equipment to any military force in the world. Its designer, John Cantius Garand, a Canadian-born engineer working at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, had spent 17 years refining the gas-operated mechanism that allowed the weapon to fire 8 rounds from an en-bloc clip as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger, without any manual cycling of a bolt between shots. The German army had captured M1 Garands throughout World War II. German soldiers who encountered them consistently reported to their commanders that they were facing a weapon that fired too fast that American units were producing a volume of fire that seemed disproportionate to their actual numbers. Adolf Hitler, presented with an M1 in 1944, reportedly called it the most dangerous implement of war in the world, though historians debate the precise circumstances of that remark. What is not disputed is what German after-action reports documented consistently. American infantry units were producing rates of fire that conventional military mathematics, based on bolt-action rifles, did not anticipate. Soviet planners knew all of this. They had access to German military records, had interrogated German officers, and understood the technical specifications of the M1 precisely. What they did not fully appreciate, until Korea demonstrated it with brutal clarity, was what that rate of fire meant in practice, when combined with the particular way American soldiers had been trained to use it. The testimony of a Chinese People's Volunteer Army captain, captured near Heartbreak Ridge in October of 1951, and interviewed extensively by U.S. Army intelligence, appears in declassified records compiled by the Foreign Military Studies Office. The captain had fought German forces briefly in the final months of the Second World War as part of a unit supplied and trained by Soviet advisors, and he drew explicit comparisons between the two experiences. German soldiers, he said, fired deliberately and with obvious fire discipline, conserving ammunition and choosing moments. American soldiers, he said, fired constantly, in volume, without appearing to ration their ammunition at all, and they were accurate while doing it. The noise alone, he told his interrogators, was a psychological weapon. A unit of 20 Americans defending a hillside sounded to attacking forces like a unit 4 times that size. The CIA's contact report on the Frankfurt defector, the Soviet colonel in the gray overcoat, runs to 41 pages in its declassified form, with certain passages still redacted. In the portions that are available, the colonel describes a series of classified assessments produced by the General Staff's Combat Analysis Directorate in 1952 and 1953, based on Chinese after-action reports from Korea, and on technical evaluations of M1 Garands captured and shipped to Soviet testing facilities. The assessments, he told his debriefers, reached a conclusion that created significant institutional friction within the Soviet military establishment. The individual American soldier, operating with his standard-issue rifle, under the doctrine of marksmanship and volume fire that American training had instilled, was producing lethality at ranges and sustained rates that Soviet infantry doctrine had not accounted for in its planning assumptions. This conclusion was uncomfortable for reasons that had nothing to do with weapons specifications. The Soviet military's doctrine of mass assault, of accepting casualties in exchange for positional objectives, of overwhelming enemy positions through numbers rather than individual marksmanship, had been validated at enormous cost in the Second World War. It was not an abstraction. It was written in the blood of approximately 8 million Soviet soldiers killed in combat between 1941 and 1945. To suggest that this doctrine was vulnerable to what amounted to superior individual shooting was to question the sacrifices that had defined the Soviet military's entire identity and the ideological framework that justified them. The argument inside Soviet planning circles, as described by multiple defectors across the 1950s and compiled in a DIA synthesis report partially declassified in 2003, divided roughly into 2 schools. One group insisted that the American advantage in individual firepower was a product of industrial development that the Soviet military was already working to replicate, that the SKS carbine and the emerging AK-47 program would close the gap, and that mass and maneuver would remain decisive at the operational level regardless of what individual soldiers carried. The second group, smaller and politically more vulnerable, argued that the Korea data suggested something more fundamental, that American training methods were producing soldiers whose individual combat effectiveness exceeded what Soviet doctrine recognized as possible, and that this discrepancy needed to be understood before it could be countered. The first group won the argument, as institutional majorities generally do. The AK-47 entered mass production, giving Soviet infantry their own automatic weapon in vast numbers, and the question of American individual marksmanship was reclassified from a doctrinal problem to a technical one. Problem identified. Solution implemented. File closed. But the Korea data did not stop producing uncomfortable results. After-action reports compiled by the Chinese People's Volunteer Army and shared with Soviet advisors embedded with their forces documented a pattern that persisted regardless of terrain, unit quality, or tactical situation. American units, when forced into defensive positions without air support, without artillery, without the machinery that Soviet doctrine identified as the true source of American combat power, continued to produce casualty ratios that the mass assault model struggled to explain. At Cheopyeong-ni in February 1951, roughly 5,000 American and French troops held a perimeter against nearly 25,000 Chinese soldiers for 2 days of continuous assault, inflicting losses estimated at 5,000 Chinese dead and wounded. The defenders had limited artillery support and no close air support for significant portions of the battle because weather-grounded aircraft. What they had was the M1 Garand, the Browning automatic rifle, the .30 caliber machine gun, and soldiers who had been trained from their first week of basic training to shoot accurately at distance and to keep shooting. A Soviet military attaché stationed in Beijing, whose reports were captured in a later defection and appear in partial form in declassified NSA signals intelligence documents from the early 1960s, described a conversation with a Chinese general who had commanded forces at Cheopyeong-ni. The general told him that the American perimeter had been like trying to walk through a wall that kept moving outward. Every attempt to find a gap in the fire produced more fire. His soldiers, the general said, could not understand how so few men could cover so much ground. The attaché's own commentary, appended to the report, noted that the Chinese general appeared genuinely bewildered rather than simply making excuses for a defeat, and that the description of American fire volume was consistent with other Chinese accounts he had reviewed. The weapon that produced this effect had been designed by a man who had immigrated to the United States from Quebec as a child and spent nearly 2 decades working without significant recognition, a government armory in Massachusetts. John Garand drew no royalties from the rifle that bore his name. The government owned the patent. He received a salary, and eventually a medal, and eventually a cash award from Congress of $100,000, which after legal fees and taxes left him considerably less. He continued working at Springfield Armory until his retirement in 1953. The same year, the Frankfurt Defector was describing the weapon's psychological effect on Soviet strategic planning to CIA officers in a house outside Frankfurt. Garand died in 1974. Not wealthy, not famous to the general public, but the author of a design that had armed American soldiers through 2 wars and had, in the estimation of planners on the other side of the world, fundamentally complicated the arithmetic of mass infantry assault. The connection between the Garand's design philosophy and the training system built around it was not accidental. The American military had been developing marksmanship as a deliberate tactical doctrine since the Spanish-American War had exposed the consequences of its absence. The National Rifle Matches at Camp Perry, Ohio, established in 1903, created a continuous feedback loop between civilian marksmanship culture and military training standards. American soldiers arrived at their first day of basic training in a country where shooting was a common recreational activity, and the training system built on that foundation rather than fighting it. By World War II, American infantry doctrine assumed a level of individual marksmanship proficiency that European armies, drawing on conscript populations with little civilian firearms experience, could not replicate through training alone. The Soviet colonel in Frankfurt understood this when he explained what had actually frightened the general staff. It was not the rifle itself, he told the CIA officers. The Soviet Union had rifles. The AK-47 was already in production and was in many technical respects superior to the aging M1 design. What the general staff could not easily replicate was the combination of the weapon with the culture and training system that produced American marksmen in the volume that American industry produced, the rifles themselves. You can copy a weapon, the colonel said, according to the declassified contact report. You cannot copy 20 million men who grew up shooting. The lesson that Soviet planners took from Korea, despite institutional resistance to its full implications, eventually manifested in a doctrinal shift that military historians have traced through declassified Warsaw Pact planning documents. The mass human wave assault, which had defined Soviet offensive doctrine since the Civil War, was quietly modified in training exercises and operational planning throughout the 1950s. The modification was not announced, not acknowledged in published doctrine, and explicitly denied in political statements. But the internal planning documents, available now in archives across the former Soviet bloc, show units being trained to suppress American defensive positions with their own automatic fire before closing, rather than absorbing fire during the advance. The lesson had been learned, even if learning it was never admitted. The Frankfurt defector finished his debriefing after 11 days. He was resettled under a new identity in a city that the CIA's contact report does not specify, consistent with the protocols that protected sources whose former colleagues remained active. His 41 pages of testimony were circulated to a limited distribution list, incorporated into larger assessments, and eventually declassified decades later, when the context that made them sensitive had dissolved along with the Soviet Union itself. His name does not appear in any public record. But the weapon he described still exists in collections, in attics, in the cases of competitive shooters at Camp Perry, where the national rifle matches have continued every August since 1903. It is heavier than modern rifles, slower to reload, unmistakably a design from an earlier era. People who handle it for the first time are sometimes surprised by how solid it feels, how precisely machined, how clearly built to last, rather than built cheaply. John Garand designed it to be carried by a soldier who might be anywhere in the world, in any weather, under any conditions, and who needed to be able to use it immediately, reliably, and accurately. He spent 17 years getting that right. The Soviet General Staff spent years trying to understand what that meant on a battlefield, and the Frankfurt defector spent 11 days explaining it to men who would spend their careers trying to ensure no one ever had to find out again.